In today's video, I am presenting this watch. If I showed this to most collectors, I know exactly what they would say. It's junk. No case, broken balance, rust, missing screws, missing parts, a movement that hasn't ticked in perhaps a century. Its value? Absolutely nothing. But I've learned something over the years. The most valuable watches are not the most expensive ones. Sometimes the greatest stories survive inside the pieces that everyone else has thrown away. This watch is one of them. When I first picked it up, I had absolutely no idea where the investigation would lead. I thought it was merely a damaged movement. Instead, I had unknowingly purchased the beginning of a mystery, one that would lead me into forgotten factories, abandoned family branches, 19th century Switzerland, Bombay, India, and even a murder investigation, all because of one tiny stamp. Whenever I acquire an unidentified watch, I resist the temptation to search for a name immediately. Instead, I treat it like an archaeologist examining an artifact recovered from an excavation. The object always speaks first. Only later do the documents begin to answer. So I examined this piece, which is a piece of material culture, and this is in fact a document. That these watch objects should be treated as documents in themselves. But immediately something caught my attention. This watch hadn't simply fallen apart through age. Someone had destroyed it. Look closely at the edges. Those aren't clean openings made by a watchmaker. They're brutal cuts. Someone had attacked the silver case with heavy metal snips. The destruction is almost painful to look at. Instead of opening the watch properly, they simply cut through the precious metal wherever it was easiest. In doing so, they damaged the movement itself. Ironically, they weren't even very good at stealing the silver. Large sections of the case still cling stubbornly to the movement today. It's almost as if the watch refused to surrender completely. Sometimes incompetence preserves history. One of the things I enjoy most about historical research is that damage can tell a story every bit as clearly as perfection. Every scratch, every broken screw, every repair, every missing component, they're all evidence. This movement tells us two stories simultaneously. The first is the story of the craftsman who built it. The second is the story of the person who destroyed it. Neither knew they were leaving clues behind. The architecture of the movement immediately suggested late 19th century Switzerland. Stem winding, industrial production, an abouche of the familiar FHF type or one of its close contemporaries. Not an extravagant observatory chronometer, not an expensive toy, simply a good, honest Swiss pocket watch built for everyday use. Millions of similar watches once crossed Europe, but this one had survived, broken, silent, anonymous, or so I thought. I spent perhaps 20 minutes examining the movement before I noticed a tiny punch, almost hidden, easy to overlook, just two words, La Châtelain. That was it. No elaborate engraving, no company history, no address, just a name. At that moment, I assumed it would simply identify the manufacturer, nothing more. I could not have been more wrong. That tiny trademark would eventually lead me to one of the founders of Record Watch Company. It would uncover forgotten branches of the Châtelain family. It would connect unexpectedly with the Montandon dynasty that I had been researching for years. It would help explain mysterious references to watchmakers operating in Bombay, India during the 19th century. It would even introduce me to a Swiss judge who investigated one of the most sensational murder cases in the Bernese Jura. Not because I was looking for any of those things, but because history has a habit of rewarding curiosity. One of the greatest misconceptions in watch collecting is that the story ends when you identify the movement. For me, that's where the story begins. Most historians would stop after identifying the manufacturer. But I wanted to know something different. Who was this person? What kind of life did he live? Who were his neighbors? Who married into his family? What factories did he establish? What newspapers mentioned him? What house did he live in and die in? Does that house still exist today? Was he remembered or forgotten? The watch simply wasn't asking to be identified. It was asking to be understood. There was only one logical place to begin. Not genealogy, not newspapers, not family archives, but the trade itself. If La Châtelain really belonged to a Swiss manufacturer, then somewhere within the great commercial directories of the 19th century, his name should appear. So I began searching through Devoin's horological almanacs, commercial registers, and the pages of La Fédération Horlogère Suisse. I expected to find a small workshop, perhaps a modest craftsman. Instead, I found one of the men responsible for building one of Switzerland's most important watch companies, and that was only the beginning. There is a moment in almost every historical investigation when a name ceases to be merely a name. Until now, Ariste Châtelain had existed only as a trademark stamped into a forgotten watch movement. A listing in a trade directory, a company registration, a factory owner, nothing more. But history rarely leaves people that one-dimensional. If you're willing to keep searching, the documents begin to breathe. They begin speaking. One by one, the pieces of someone's life slowly emerges from the archives, and that is exactly what happened here. The first surprise wasn't another document, it was a photograph. After spending days examining company registrations, trademarks, and commercial directories, I suddenly found myself looking directly into the eyes of the man whose name had been hidden inside this damaged movement. This is Ariste Châtelain, born in 1843. His expression is calm, confident, the face of a man who had spent a lifetime of solving problems. At this point, I knew almost nothing about him, yet one question immediately occurred to me. Who exactly was this man, and why had history remembered him so profoundly? Most 19th century watchmakers leave surprisingly small historical footprints. Perhaps a baptism, a marriage, an advertisement, a death notice, then silence. Ariste was different. The deeper I searched, the larger his shadow became. Every few years, another document appeared, then another and another. Slowly, an entirely different picture emerged. He was certainly a watchmaker, but that was only the beginning. To understand Ariste Châtelain, we first have to understand the place that shaped him. Today, Tramelan is a quiet community nestled among the forests and hills of the Bernese Jura. In the 19th century, however, it was transforming into one of Switzerland's most energetic centers of industrial watchmaking. The old cottage industries were giving way to organized factories, steam power, mechanized production, joint stock companies, international exports. Entire villages were reinventing themselves through precision engineering. Ariste Châtelain grew up during precisely this transformation. He was not merely witnessing industrial history, he was helping create it. The next clue appeared in Devoin's Horological Almanac. Unlike modern histories written decades later, these directories were contemporary. They recorded businesses as they actually existed. Turning to Tramelan-Dessous, there he was, Ariste Châtelain, manufacturer, specializing in German, Dutch, and Austrian watches. At first glance, this seems like a simple commercial listing. It is anything but. It tells us his workshop had grown large enough to manufacture specifically for foreign markets. That required organization, capital, employees, commercial agents, reliable export networks. This was no village craftsman making watches one at a time. He was participating in an international industry. The commercial journals soon revealed something even more remarkable. Ariste's name appeared repeatedly, not because he was making watches, but because he was organizing factories. The pages of La Fédération Horologère Suisse document an astonishing sequence of company registrations, reorganizations, liquidations, and administrative appointments. Each notice seems insignificant. Taken together, they tell an entirely different story. Ariste was becoming one of the principal industrial figures of Tramelan. His name appears alongside Record Dreadnought, Locust Watch Company, Dreadnought Watch Company, corporate boards, commercial restructurings, factory management. Rather than belonging to one company, he belonged to an industrial network. Every notice expands our understanding of his responsibilities. One document stood above all the others, the creation of Record Watch Company. Today, collectors know Record as one of Switzerland's respected manufacturers of reliable precision watches. But every great company begins somewhere. For Record, one of those beginnings was Ariste Châtelain. Commercial records identify him as the company's first chairman. Imagine discovering that a tiny trademark inside an anonymous watch movement belonged not simply to another forgotten craftsman, but to one of the founders of one of Switzerland's great watch manufacturers. The movement had already exceeded every expectation, yet history still had more to reveal. Then I found his obituary. Obituaries are fascinating historical documents. They tell us not merely that someone died. They tell us what their contemporaries believed mattered most. Reading Ariste Châtelain's obituary, one sentence immediately stood out. L'œuvre maîtresse d'Ariste Châtelain fut la création de la fabrique de horologerie Record. The masterwork of Ariste Châtelain was the creation of the Record Watch Company. Not his wealth, not his political career, not even his judicial service. His contemporaries believed his greatest contribution had been the creation of Record itself. That single sentence says more about his legacy than pages of corporate history. But the obituary continued. Each paragraph revealed another surprise. He had presided over the local primary school for 22 years. He had helped establish Tramelan's secondary school in 1874. He played a leading role in communal administration. Whenever the municipality required organization or leadership, his name appeared. He served as a banker, an administrator, eventually a judge. Later, vice president of the tribunal. It became increasingly difficult to describe him simply as a watchmaker. He was one of the men shaping 19th century Tramelan itself. At this point, many historians would probably stop. The biography had been reconstructed, the industrial career understood, the commercial history documented. For me, however, this is where the real investigation begins. Who was his family? Where did they come from? Who did they marry? Who worked beside them? What other watchmaking families entered their lives? These questions cannot be answered through commercial records alone. To answer them, we must leave the factory and enter the archives of ordinary life. Civil registers, marriage records, church books, probate files, family trees, newspapers, private correspondence, obituaries, and gradually an entire family begins to reappear. Genealogy has a remarkable way of changing history. Instead of studying companies, we begin studying people. Instead of asking when a factory opened, we ask who stood beside the founder, who married his daughter, who became his apprentice, who immigrated, who returned, who disappeared. Families often preserve connections that businesses never record. And almost immediately, the Châtelain family began leading somewhere entirely unexpected. At first, the connections seemed ordinary. Watchmakers marrying watchmakers. Industrial families marrying industrial families. This was exactly what one would expect in the Jura. Then another surname appeared, Montandon. At first, I thought it was coincidence. The Jura is full of old horological families. Surely this meant nothing. But then another Montandon appeared, and another, and another. Suddenly, I realized I was no longer dealing with isolated marriages. I was looking at an entire web of family relationships connecting two important watchmaking dynasties across multiple generations. One marriage immediately caught my attention. Bernese Châtelain and Marie-Anne Montandon, born in 1768, a member of the Montandon-Éveillon branch. At first glance, it appeared to be an ordinary 18th century marriage. It wasn't. This couple seems to have been among those drawn into one of the most ambitious experiments in European watchmaking, the Megavand migration to Besançon. Following the French Revolution, hundreds of Swiss watchmakers crossed the frontier to establish a new horological industry in France. This marriage places the Châtelain family directly within that remarkable story. The investigation has suddenly moved from one damaged watch movement to one of the great migrations of Swiss industrial history. Another marriage appeared decades later, Louis-Auguste Montandon-Clerc, régleur à la chaux de fonds. He married Laure Estelle Châtelain. Again, two horological families becoming one. This was no coincidence. Marriage was one of the invisible mechanisms through which knowledge, workshops, apprenticeships, and commercial relationships spread throughout the Jura. Family history was industrial history. Then everything changed. For years, I had been trying to solve one of the strangest puzzles in Montandon watch history. Scattered references appeared throughout the 19th century in Bombay, India. F. Montandon, Châtelain Montandon, F. Châtelain Montandon, and T. Châtelain Montandon. Also Châtelain Montandon and Company. These references were tantalizing, but frustratingly incomplete. Were these companies, family firms, partnerships, jewelers, watchmakers, merchants? Nobody seemed to know. I had searched for years without finding the missing connection. Then, this damaged watch movement quietly supplied it. The genealogy revealed Tel Châtelain. His wife was Frédérique Emma Montandon. Her father, Pierre Frédéric Montandon. For the first time, the Bombay references began fitting into a coherent family network. I had not set out to solve the Bombay mystery. I had only wanted to identify a damaged watch movement. History, however, often rewards the questions we never intended to ask. At this stage, the little trademark La Châtelaine had already revealed far more than I had ever imagined possible. a forgotten manufacturer, one of the founders of Record, an educator, banker, politician, judge, multiple generations of interconnected watchmaking families, unexpected links to the Montandon dynasty, and perhaps the first convincing explanation for the mysterious Châtelain Montandon references that had puzzled me for years. I thought I had reached the end of the story. I was wrong, because hidden among the newspapers was one final surprise. A surprise that had nothing to do with watches, or so it first appeared. It began with a murder in the forest near Plagna in the winter of 1925. There is an old saying among historians: always follow the evidence. It sounds straightforward enough. In reality, it can lead you to places you never imagined. That is exactly what happened here. When I first sat down at my workbench to examine this damaged movement, I believed I was beginning a fairly ordinary piece of horological research. Identify the movement, identify the manufacturer, reconstruct the company, perhaps learn a little bit about the man who built it, nothing more. I had absolutely no expectation that this investigation would eventually lead me to court records, criminal proceedings, and one of the most widely reported murder cases in the Bernese Jura. Yet that is precisely where the evidence took me. There is one small coincidence that I only discovered much later. I began photographing and documenting this watch on the 17th of July. At the time, the date meant absolutely nothing to me. It was simply the day I happened to choose to begin this little exercise in what I like to call Pocket Watch Archaeology. Only after days of research did I discover something unexpected. The murderer whose life would eventually become intertwined with this investigation, Alfred Gasser, had been born on the 17th of July, 1891. Of course, this is nothing more than coincidence. History is full of coincidences. But every researcher occasionally encounters one of those curious moments when the past seems almost to acknowledge the investigation. It certainly caught my attention. By now, I believed I understood Ariste Châtelain. I had reconstructed his industrial career, his companies, his trademarks, his role in establishing Record Watch Company, his connections to the Montandon family, his home on Grande Rue in Tramalan. Even the building where he spent the final years of his life still stands today. As far as I was concerned, the investigation was essentially complete. Then I made one final search. I typed his name into historical newspaper archives. That single search changed everything. The newspaper that appeared was not discussing watches. It was not discussing factories, nor was it discussing Record Watch Company. Instead, the headline described a criminal investigation. There in the middle of the article was the name I had become so familiar with, Ariste Châtelain. Only now he was identified not as a manufacturer, but as a judge. I remember stopping for a second. I had become so accustomed to thinking of him as a watchmaker that seeing him in proceedings over a murder investigation came as a genuine surprise. It was one of those moments historians experience from time to time when a familiar figure suddenly appears in an entirely different setting. The man behind the little La Châtelaine trademark had lived a much larger life than I had imagined. The newspapers carried readers back to the winter of 1925. On January 24th, a young married woman named Giuseppina Bagna, née Bonato, left her home in Olten carrying approximately 600 francs. She never returned. Weeks later, her body was discovered in a forest near Plagna in the Bernese Jura. The case immediately attracted widespread attention. Newspapers across Switzerland followed the investigation almost daily. As I read them one after another, I realized something remarkable. I was no longer reading history. I was watching an investigation unfold, almost exactly as readers had experienced it 100 years earlier. Each newspaper contributed another piece of the puzzle. A witness, a new lead, a forensic discovery, another interview. It was like assembling a historical film frame by frame. Very quickly, investigators focused on one individual. His name was Alfred Gasser. He was 34 years old. The newspapers describe a man whose life lacked stability. One report called him a miner at the local mines. Another described him as a mason. Elsewhere he appears as a gardener. Other reports simply refer to him as a laborer. What becomes clear is that he drifted from occupation to occupation without establishing a permanent profession. His personal history was equally troubled. He already possessed a criminal record. The newspapers mentioned previous convictions for theft and burglary. He had already served time in prison. This was not a respected member of the community, suddenly accused of an unimaginable crime. He was already known to the authorities. And then, remarkably, the world of horology appeared once again. While researching Alfred Gasser's family, I discovered that his father had worked as a mechanic at the Fabrique de Horologerie de Sonsabos. Collectors will immediately recognize that name. Sonsabos would later become part of the great industrial reorganization that eventually produced ESA and later ETA. Today, one of the world's best-known movement manufacturers within the Swatch Group. Even here, in what seemed to be a completely unrelated criminal investigation, Swiss watchmaking quietly reappeared. It was another reminder that in the Jura, nearly every family was connected to the watch industry in one way or another. Then, the newspapers became even more interesting. Article after article described the progress of the investigation. Each time, the same name appeared, Judge Ariste Châtelain. The little trademark hidden inside my damaged watch movement suddenly acquired an entirely different meaning. This was no anonymous manufacturer. He was one of the men responsible for administering justice in his community. He questioned witnesses, reviewed evidence, oversaw proceedings, made decisions affecting the lives of ordinary people. The watchmaker and the judge were the same individual. I had uncovered an entirely different chapter of his life. The investigation gradually tightened around Alfred Gasser. Witnesses had observed him traveling with Giuseppina shortly before her disappearance. When he was arrested, police recovered a loaded revolver from his possession. Subsequent forensic examination concluded that it was the very weapon used in the crime. As each newspaper was published, the picture became clearer and clearer. The scattered reports slowly assembled themselves into a complete historical narrative. It reminded me very much of assembling the broken fragments of a watch movement. Individually, each piece tells only a small part of the story. Together, they reveal the whole. The trial concluded later that year. Alfred Gasser was found guilty. He received a sentence of 20 years imprisonment. For Ariste Châtelain, this would prove to be one of the final major responsibilities of an already extraordinary public life. Only a few years later, in 1928, he himself would pass away. His obituary remembered him as a manufacturer, an educator, a civic leader, the founder of Record, and a respected judge. What it could never have imagined was that nearly a century later, a damaged watch movement bearing his trademark would lead someone to reconstruct all of those lives once again. As though the investigation had already not taken enough unexpected turns, one more document emerged. This time it was dated 1903. Not a newspaper, not a company register, a decision of the Federal Supreme Court of Switzerland. Once again, Ariste Châtelain appears in the records. This time not as a judge, but as a creditor in debt enforcement proceedings involving the disputed ownership of a cow and a heifer. The case ultimately confirmed that the seizure remained legally valid after the claimant failed to follow the prescribed legal procedure, allowing Ariste Châtelain to retain the benefit of the seizure. It is an unusual case, but it illustrates something important. Real people do not live within neat historical categories. Watchmakers bought property, lent money, served in public office, settled disputes, raised families, presided over courts. Their lives were every bit as complex as our own. When I acquired this movement, I thought I was receiving a broken piece of machinery. Instead, I had unknowingly acquired the beginning of a historical investigation. One small trademark led to a factory. The factory led to a family. The family led to the Montandon dynasty. The genealogy led to Bombay, India. The newspapers led to a courtroom. The courtroom led to a murder investigation. And all of it began with a watch that most people would have thrown into the scrap bin. That, to me, is the essence of Geneahorology. Every watch is an archaeological artifact, not because of the metal from which it was made, but because every surviving watch still carries the fingerprints of the people whose lives became intertwined with it. Sometimes, if we are patient enough to follow the evidence where it leads, those forgotten lives begin to speak again.